Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of dead come back?
Cushi by Christopher Woodforde. Although it is little more than 40 miles from London, you would be likely to lose your way in trying to find Rooksgate Green in Hertfordshire. It's hidden away in the chalk hills and is curiously suited to its name. The green is large and is still common ground. There is a pond and there are many geese. Around it are scattered cottages of various sizes and considerable antiquity. A road runs through the green. It is no longer gated, but the gateposts still remain at each end of the green. Just beyond there is a dilapidated clunch-built church, which is the parish church of Cotterley, although it's nearly 3 miles from that village. By the church is a very large and ugly red brick rectory, surrounded by tall elms, in which the rooks live noisily. If you visited Rooksgate Green on a cold winter's day, you would be sure that no place in England could be colder. If you visited it in high summer, you would know how hot these chalk uplands can be. It might not be expected that Rooksgate Green produces much news for the large world around it. Indeed, it seems never to have done so. It once had an important fair, but this has dwindled to a few roundabouts, swings and stalls, which still arrive on the eve of the feast of St. John Baptist, under whose patronage Cotterley Church was placed. Yet in the year 1939 there was a very strange occurrence, which may be recorded in some detail. Undoubtedly the most striking person in the hamlet was Cushi Holloway. He was probably about 60 years of age. He was short in stature and somewhat lame. He was bald and had a striking face. It was one of those faces which tell of a strong character, an acute brain, but it is difficult to say whether that character was benevolent or not. Perhaps enigmatic is the best word to describe it. No one had ever seen Cushi, as he was universally called, put out. He was entirely imperturbable. He lived with his old and rather formidable mother in one of the better cottages on the green, and he was sexton of Cotterley Church. He had no other occupation, and the other inhabitants were never able to find out how he and his mother were able to live in reasonable comfort. He spent much time in and about the church, and he was a storehouse of information about its history during the last 50 years. He could remember every visiting preacher, what text he had chosen for his sermon, what the weather was like, and what was the size of the congregation on each occasion. As a sexton he was invaluable. He was never late. He alone could induce the antiquated stoves to produce sufficient heat to make the church bearable in winter, and he alone could trim the oil lamps so that they did not smoke violently in the middle of the service. No one disputed his claim to dig the neatest grave in the district. Beneath the faded red cushion in his seat in church he stored strange reading matter. There was the current Old Moore's Almanac, a recent catalogue issued by a famous firm of seedsmen, and a copy of Struwwel Peter. He knew by heart the number and first line of every hymn in Hymns Ancient and Modern. This last accomplishment expressed itself constantly in a curious way. When Cushi was not in his house, the church or the churchyard, he would stand for long periods by the pond at the side of the road, acknowledging with the jerk of his head such greetings as came his way. Every car, van, lorry and tractor that passed was given its appropriate hymn according to its registration number. Thus, a lorry bringing materials to repair the horseshoe was 196, Guide Me, O Thou Great Redeemer. And Mr. Johnson's bright new tractor was 392, Forward be our watchword. When there were 4 numerals, the first 3 or the last 3 were usually chosen. Cushi rose to new heights when the bishop arrived to conduct a confirmation. The bishop had been told of Cushi's activities in this direction, and after the service asked what his car number represented. "What are you, my lord?" was the reply. "You're 2 Advents, you are. 51, lo he comes. 52, great God, what do I see and hear? Up in the pulpit." By way of extension, the appropriate number and words might be produced on other occasions. Thus, when the eldest daughter of Mr. Hodges, who kept the stores, married, Cushi produced as a wedding present a large box of chocolates with the remark 109, sweet the moment's rich in blessing, which might have expressed Cushi's hopes either for her enjoyment of the sweets, or for a successful marriage service, or for happy years of connubial bliss. At the end of the year 1936, the rector, the Reverend Charles French, died. He had been rector of Cotterley for 42 years, and Cushi was deeply affected. His sorrow was not expressed in words beyond the remark, "He were a good un, he were," but it was fully expressed in the care he took over the preparation of Mr. French's grave. It was wholly lined with flowers, and the heap of earth and chalk thrown out beside it was covered with cut grass. It was some time before a new appointment was made. Cushi eyed such clergymen as came to inspect the church and rectory and said nothing. The odd assortment of parsons and lay readers who conducted the services on Sunday and the few marriages and funerals on weekday added considerably to his store of anecdotes. Eventually, the bishop made an appointment, which was far from a happy one. The Reverend David Evans was being overworked in a huge parish on the outskirts of London and needed rest. He was devoted to forms of worship far higher than Cotterley and Rooksgate Green could ever tolerate or understand. He had grown up in Cardiff and was wholly ignorant of the ways of an English village. He was somewhat shy, which the villagers mistook for off-handedness. Above all, he made the unpardonable mistake of trying at once to wake up his new flock. If he had won Cushi's approval and support, he might have survived the earlier criticisms, for he was a good and earnest man, but he began by unwittingly dealing blow after blow at his sexton. The first incident was concerned with Cushi's attendance at Holy Communion. On the second Sunday after his institution, Mr. Evans said, I do not like grumbling about things, Cushi, but I must ask you to desist from making your communion twice. If you communicate at 8 o'clock, you must not do so at the later celebration. Mr. French, he liked me at both houses, retorted Cushi. Mr. Evans winced. I also like to see you at both services, said he, but the church does not allow anyone but a priest to make his communion more than once in a day. And while we are on this subject, I would much prefer that you do not dust the choir stalls with your handkerchief when you are returning from the altar. Cushi said nothing. The second incident was the forbidding by Mr. Evans of a very curious custom. Cushi had what Rooksgate Green people described as a wonderful way with cats. Indeed, there was something uncanny about it. His cats were always jet black and were named Ought 1 and Ought 2, Ought 3, and so on. They had been trained, no one knew how, to follow him in a well-ordered line. By custom, they were allowed to accompany him to baptisms. During the service, the cats sat in a semicircle. Long ago, the dumbness of the godparents had caused Cushi to answer for them, so that the responses were apt to run, "He will, back, Ought 2. He will, sit up, Ought 4. The Green sharply criticised the rector for the banning of the cats. They had come to believe that their presence foreshadowed good luck for the newly baptised infants. The third alteration in Cushi's routine concerned the funerals. In the past, when Mr. French pronounced the solemn words, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, Cushi had thrown large lumps of clunch upon the coffin with 3 resounding thuds. Mr. Evans regarded this as irreligious and likely to harrow the feelings of the mourners unnecessarily. In this he was wrong. The people of Rooksgate Green understood the mortality of man better than did the inhabitants of Sedgewoollow Lane, Cardiff, or of Borrow Drive, SE18. Nevertheless, Mr. Evans persisted in himself dropping a few grains of earth into the grave. Cushi did not remark upon these changes to other people, and it could not be divined how much he minded them. But perhaps signs were not wanting that Mr. Evans did not have it quite all his own way. For instance, he wore white linen vestments, whereas Mr. French had always worn a surplice and stole. Mr. Evans had shown forbearance here because he liked bright colours suitable to the church's seasons. Cushi viewed the vestments with a suspicion bred of a very Protestant ancestry. The church was damp, and the vestments could not be left there during the week. They were carried to the church each Sunday in a suitcase, Mr. Evans asked Cushi to call for them and to lay them out in readiness and to carry them back afterwards. Mr. Evans could not but notice how often they were torn, or a button was missing, but he did not feel able to ask Cushi if he had anything to do with it. Matters continued thus for about a 12-month. Mr. Evans found that the comparatively large congregations of the first few weeks were dwindling. He commented upon this to his rural dean. "Don't worry," replied that worthy, "it's always the same. They come just once or twice to hear how you preach, and you won't see them again until the harvest festival." "I fear that it's going to be a very uphill task," sighed Mr. Evans, "and you can never tell what they're really thinking." "Of course you can't," said the rural dean cheerfully, "and you never will know. You're lucky to have that man Cushi Holloway. It's almost impossible to find sextons and grave diggers nowadays, let alone anyone to cut the grass in the churchyard." "Am I?" asked Mr. Evans, and added doubtfully, "Yes, I suppose I am." It was on his return from his visit to the rural dean that his housekeeper told him that Cushi was ill. Cushi had walked, as his custom was, to the market town of Arlton, and had got drenched with rain on the return journey. Mr. Evans called at his cottage after tea and inquired of Mrs. Holloway how her son was. He was told politely that Cushi was not very well. A daily visit produced exactly the same reply, and no suggestion that he should go upstairs and see Cushi. On the 5th day, Cushi was dead. The undertaker called at the rectory and said that the funeral would be on Thursday at 3 o'clock with no music. Mr. Evans was not a little annoyed. "Supposing, Mr. Spearman," he said, "that day and time are inconvenient for me." "Well, sir," replied Mr. Spearman, "I'd manage it somehow if I were you. The people would be very put up if you tried to change it. You know how it is in these places." Mr. Evans was beginning to know how it was in those places, so he fell in with the arrangements with an ill grace. The whole village turned out for the funeral, some attending the service in church and at the graveside, some going to the church only, and some looking on from a distance, according to a quite indefinable rule. On the next Sunday evening, following local custom, Mr. Evans spoke about Cushi before he preached, and after the sermon announced Cushi's favourite hymn, 386, "The Sower Went Forth Sowing," a hymn for which he had a particular loathing. On the following day he called upon Mrs. Holloway. She opened the door, but did not make room for him to enter. He began to express some sentiments of sympathy. She interrupted him with simple dignity. "You didn't like my Cushi, and my Cushi couldn't abide you, so it's best to say nothing." Mr. Evans found the door shut in his face and turned away, more sharply rebuffed than he had ever been in his life before. It was only a week after this that Mr. Evans himself took to his bed. The doctor came and examined him. When he had finished, he said that he would call again in the morning. Meanwhile, Mr. Evans was to lie still and to take some tablets which must be got from the chemist as soon as possible. At 10 o'clock that night, he received a message to say that Mr. Evans had passed away in his sleep. He was not altogether surprised, and was able to tell the coroner that the state of Mr. Evans's heart made an inquest unnecessary. Mr. Spearman's services were again required. Some long-distance telephone conversations resulted in the arrangement that he should make the best possible unpolished oak coffin and dispatch the mortal remains of Mr. Evans to Cardiff for burial. The village was comparatively unaffected by the death of Mr. Evans. He had not been long amongst them, and they had not been impressed by what they had seen of him. The general verdict that he would never have done for the likes of we was perhaps a fair epitaph upon his short ministry at Rooksgate Green. So matters might have rested. The advent of evacuees, the blackout, the ARP and Home Guard, and all the restrictions of war were fully occupying their minds. The living of Cotterley was taken by a quiet and inoffensive missionary who had recently returned from India. His parishioners found little to criticise in him, save that he was too apt to bring his Indian experiences into his sermons, and to cover a small table by the south door of the church with booklets and pamphlets showing the activities and needs of coloured Christians. It will never be known why some German airman decided to unloose his bombs upon Rooksgate Green. Perhaps a few scattered lights suggested to him that it was a larger and more important place. Be that as it may, he let fall 6 bombs. As far as could be immediately discovered in the darkness, they had neither killed nor wounded man or beast, although windows and ceilings suffered, especially those of the rectory. It was first discovered by Harry Pitman and Walter Broom that one of the bombs had fallen in the churchyard. When daylight came, they inspected the damage. The bomb had fallen in that part of the churchyard where the most recent burials had taken place. One coffin had been excavated by the missile, and its lid had been torn off, exposing the grisly contents. Harry took one glance at it and turned quickly away. Walter was reading the name upon the brass plate on the coffin lid. "God!" exclaimed he. "It's old Cushi." "No," replied Walter, going over to look at it. He spelt out the name. "You're right, eh?" he said after a pause. "It's poor old Cushi. Whatever would he have said to that, Walt?" They turned, as if by common consent, to look into the coffin once again. The remains of Cushi Holloway had, by some strange chance, been undisturbed by the explosion. Suddenly Harry Pitman pointed, speechless. Walter Broom looked more intently and then gasped. "Well, whatever do you make of that?" he asked at length. That was the undoubted fact that within what remained of his arms, Cushi was hugging a human skull. "We can't leave things like this for the women and children to see," said Harry. "Do you slip over to the rectory for the key of the churchyard shed. We'll get a couple of shovels and put Cushi back where he belongs. Ask the rector to step back with you. Maybe he'll want to read a bit of a service over him." The rector came and saw and wondered. When the men's work was accomplished and Cushi was safely at rest again, he turned to them. "How do you think the skull got there?" he asked. "Can't rightly say," replied Harry. "There's something unnatural happened here, rector. You may depend upon it. Would you say, Walt?" "Yes, right enough," said Walter. "Whose head was it, do you think?" asked the rector. "It's past telling, as you saw for yourself, sir," said Harry. "I wouldn't swear to it, but what hair there was left was just like the Reverend Evans's." He paused and then continued. "Yeah, I reckon that if you was to go to that cemetery at Cardiff where he was put away and dug him up, you'd find he ain't got no head." "But we will say nothing to anyone about this, to anyone," suggested the rector. "That's right," said Walter, as he picked up the shovels. "It was always best to leave old Cushi to follow his own way."
If you enjoy the Classic Ghost Stories podcast and want to support the show, consider becoming a member on Patreon. You'll get early access to episodes, bonus content, and the feeling of helping keep these haunting tales alive. And if YouTube is your preferred place to listen, you can join as a member there instead. No need to sign up for both. It's the same content either way. So, if you'd like to support the podcast and keep the ghostly tales coming, head over to Patreon or join on YouTube. Either way, every membership helps another tale rise from the grave of the past.
So that was Cushi by Christopher Woodforde, and I got that from the Oxford Book of English Ghost Stories. So Christopher Woodforde, interesting chap. My notes say, few figures are as intriguingly paradoxical as Christopher Woodforde. By day, he was a meticulous scholar of medieval stained glass and a respected Anglican dean, key point. By night, or rather by candlelight, in the dormitories of New College, Oxford, he was spinning tales of supernatural terror for young choristers that would eventually become one of the finest collections in the Jamesian tradition. Remember, M.R. James loves these Anglican clergymen in old churches, doesn't he? So he was a lad from Somerset, born November 29th, 1907, and he grew up surrounded by the very medieval churches and ancient glass that would later make his scholarly reputation. After attending King's School, Bruton, he went to Peterhouse, Cambridge, before training for Holy Orders at Wells Theological College, obviously in Somerset. I was in Wells, not recently, a very lovely little town, Wells. I've been a few times. A fitting preparation for a man who would eventually return to Wells as its dean. He was ordained as a deacon in 1930 and very likely priested in 1932. That's how you say it, the verb to priest. I priested him. That's what the bishop might say. Woodforde began his clerical career with a series of curacies in East Anglia and Lincolnshire, the heart of the English ghost story tradition. There was a guy on saying, "Oh, there's nothing much happens in East Anglia." I said, "You what?" East Anglia is the epicenter of the English ghost story tradition, mainly because of James and his followers. And of course, Cambridge University was a kind of seedbed for ghost stories of this particular kind, and that it is technically East Anglia, Cambridge, and it is, somebody may dispute that, but I think it is, and it's just on its doorstep anyway. So in these early postings, he was already developing a passion for medieval glass, publishing his first article on medieval painted glass in Norfolk in 1931 when he was just 24 years old. And I know many 24-year-olds of my acquaintance are passionate about medieval painted glass. It's underappreciated. I'm so far away from being 24 now, I don't even know what they are passionate about. Honestly, I couldn't even make an educated guess. It'll be something I don't approve of. Or not necessarily don't approve of, that I find pointless. But they would probably have the same view about me, so fair enough. The scholar detective. What made Woodforde extraordinary as a scholar was his combination of rigorous academic method with genuine detective work. He would cycle from church to church across Norfolk, Suffolk and Lincolnshire, often discovering forgotten fragments of medieval glass tucked away in vestries or lying unrecognised in church storage. His approach was both deeply learned and refreshingly practical. He understood not just the iconography and the dating of glass, but also the social and liturgical context that gave it meaning. You should realise that there was a lot of medieval stained glass in the churches of England, and then comes the English Civil War in the mid-17th century, sort of 1640s and stuff like that. There were two bits of the Civil War, and the Puritans didn't really believe in anything like this, so they smashed it all, along with a lot of the sculpture. We may now say, and then of course before that, when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries to get his hands on their cash, there was a lot of destruction of church art at that time as well. So great, it was associated, with popery and by the brand of burning brands of the evangelicals, the Puritan evangelicals, who later went to America and set up the whole country. There we are. So he had established himself by the 1940s as a leading authority on medieval stained glass in England. His major work, Stained Glass in Somerset in 1946, you could see that was going to come, couldn't you? You could have probably, once he did the stained glass in Norfolk, medieval painted glass in Norfolk, you could see the Somerset volume was going to come. The Norwich School of Glass Painting, fair enough. And then he kind of broadens out a bit, and the whole country is his easel. And he creates a book called, normally called Publishing a Book, called, maybe made it himself, I don't know, English Stained and Painted Glass, 1954. I bet he didn't. He wasn't a William Morris of a man. But they're essential references today, and he got an honorary literary doctorate of literature in 1947 from Cambridge, his local place, followed by Oxford in 1948. I think Oxford is closer to Somerset than Cambridge is, but he went to Cambridge, to Peterhouse. In 48, he was invited to become chaplain and fellow of New College, Oxford, one of the most prestigious positions in Anglican academia. It was here in those ancient quadrangles that his supernatural imagination truly flourished. As chaplain, he was responsible for the spiritual welfare of the college's famous choir of boy trebles. To help settle them at bedtime, he began telling them ghost stories of his own invention. They weren't your typical children's tales, and so, they have this M.R. James type thing featuring antiquarian protagonists who discover that old objects, manuscripts, church furnishings, stained glass windows carry with them echoes of ancient evil. In 1952, the publisher J.M. Dent published these chorister tales that he'd written as a pad in the straw, complete with atmospheric. Yeah, okay, pad in the straw. Weird wording there for us, but of course, clunch is a word I wasn't familiar with, and it may be a local kind of East Anglian chalk country word. It's a big lump of chalk, a clunch. I didn't know that. So he publishes these. The title comes from an old folk remedy, a pad of straw. A pad of straw placed on the chest of a corpse prevents the spirit from walking. It was a perfect metaphor for Woodforde's approach to the supernatural, scholarly, antiquarian, but with its shiver of genuine dread. There are pictures of him on the internet dressed as a priest, and he looks the kind of most straight guy. Square. Hey man, he's a square. But he clearly wasn't. So there are 20 stories in the collection. Go out and buy it. I don't get a cut. I'm just saying, go and buy it. There's no self-promotion here. I've got no angle on this. I've got no skin in the game. It's good. Yes, good. And it's illustrated by John Young Bateman. So you get the illustrations and the stories. It's pretty good. So there's various stories in this collection. Ex Libris, a 15th century account book once owned by a murdered clergyman. Dun, dun. No spoilers. The Chalk Pit. There's a lot of chalk involved in this. Features attacking. Now, Somerset's not chalk country. Attacking creatures traced back to... But clearly, this part of Hertfordshire is. Hertfordshire really isn't East Anglia, I don't think, that he's put this in. It's kind of... The home counties, really, north of London. But it's interesting that these days it's probably kind of a suburb. And it's interesting about their language there. I would imagine in the 1930s and 40s, they still sounded quite country. But I imagine now everybody there talks kind of estuary English. The Doom Window at Brecon. So it's all good stuff. He has this insider knowledge of church life and medieval artifacts. When he describes a brass rowing or a piece of ancient glass, you can feel the weight of his expertise. He knows everything about it. In the same way, when M.I. James talks about manuscripts, he knew what he was talking about. He was the expert on manuscripts, Apparently he had a sharp, sardonic wit that could be both entertaining and cutting. His wife, Muriel, who he loved very much, died in 1951 and became more isolated and increasingly sharp-tongued. His personal tragedy may have influenced his later work, and his 1954 English-stained and painted glass was criticised as terse and almost unreadable, though this may have reflected his emotional state as much as his scholarly rigour. So, maybe he just wrote it you would have thought, who's picking that book up? It's people who are fairly into the subject, and people who are into things, whether that be Grand Theft Auto or medieval stained glass. If they're really into it, they're really into it, Let's go and look at the story. So I got it from the Book of English Ghost Stories, but it's in his pad book, Pad of Straw. So Cushi. It's a very pleasant story, isn't it? We get everything we like about the Midsummer Murders. Because I've said before, Midsummer Murders is the stories were so long and convoluted. I never followed them really. But what was nice about it was this ambience, this English village thing going on. Agatha Christie does it as well, of course. Murder of Roger Ackroyd, the village there, Abbots, I can't remember the word now. Abbots Bromley, I want to say, but that's a real place. I often say, I've said it before, why do we like books? Well, we like the narrative. We're the techniques of narrative writing keep us driving us forward. We want to find out. Yeah, we like books because of that reason. We like them because of the characters. Think of Sherlock Holmes. Think of Gandalf. James Bond. Or we're invested. Maigret. We're invested in the characters. And we get to know them and like them. And that's true for Midsummer Murders and all of those long-standing series, really. Think of the modern retelling of Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch. It is, well, both of them, the story there with John Thingy. Come on. But the characters are really endearing, aren't they? John Watson, yes, of course. But the characters are really endearing and they do them both so well. They're such good actors. I'm making the point. Narrative, character. One of the other reasons is vibe. I think, and I've quoted many times how people talk about old Ligotti's well, I suppose he is now. Aren't we all old? Maybe you aren't. But, you know, his it's the vibe. People have talked about how, you know, often the story's really hard to follow, but we just like the vibe. That's what we're after. We're after the atmosphere, and I think that's a very, very long way of saying he does it really well, doesn't it? We have this fantastic description. It opens with the description of the English village, and we're like, I want to go there. I might even want to rent a cottage there for 6 months, and just you know, it would be great at Christmas. It would be lovely in the summer. It would be really good. And, you know, even in those days, we still have a functioning church. So, and there's a pub and a store, and it's got everything you want. And so it's kind of like, yeah, we'd like to live there and have a cottage with roses round, and a cat, obviously, and some runner beans, little garden. Be nice. And we get rid of the car, and we just get the bus into the local market town. It would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, so that's the vibe. It pulls us in. And we have the interesting character Cushi, who's like one of these village eccentrics. Now, he'd probably get diagnosed with something these days. I'm not going to debase myself. That's a bit of a hard word, but I'm not going to kind of... yeah, let's not do that. But yeah, he probably would. And I can think of a number of candidates for his diagnosis. But... there we are. But he's amusing, isn't he? And I love the black cats and the fact, but I think, and this is the key thing about the story, it's a very simple story. And we could read it, you know, if we bring our critical lenses to it, we could read in Jungian shadows or Marxist dialectic or, heaven forfend, queer theory. I only say that because I did one story and I looked at it through the lens of queer theory. There were a lot of terse comments into it, you know, from retired colonels in the home counties. Dear sir. But I, you know, sometimes I just like to be naughty and wind you up, even when I know I'm going to be winding you up. But anyway, we could really struggle, or formal critical theory or whatever. But what I want to say is this, it seems to me, is it's on the broad aspect. It's the rural versus the urban. In the urban, everything changes. People are tolerant. They change all the time. They're used to new things. They're open. In the country, that's not the case. Things tend... I've lived in small villages, and I've enjoyed living in small villages. And people, there are ways that you do things, and there's a great comfort and beauty in that, really. And people look out for each other. There's community, you know. So I'm not dissing the city with its change and its openness to new things and cultural blah blah, you know. And when I say blah blah, I'm not running it down. I'm just because I couldn't think of any words. So there's that conflict, and we've seen it all. I maybe told this story before once. I was when I was doing safeguarding, probably about 2000 just before COVID. No, it was before COVID. So I was at a hospital trust, and we look after 2 general hospitals, and I was the adult safeguarding lead. And we used interpreters more and more. We were getting people coming in who didn't speak English. Big demographic, can't say it, changes in England over the past 10 years. Anyway, we won't go into that either. But so what we were getting, and there was use of interpreters, and I remember we had a lecture from this interpreter's body about cultural differences and how we should use interpreters. And they were saying, if you get somebody from the Pashtun community or a certain place, they may know each other, and they will spend, and she was making the point that the first, you know, whereas this Western business idea is you cut straight to the point and you don't mess around with, and I think that's possibly an Anglo-Saxon thing, possibly an East Coast American thing, Northeast Coast American thing, whereby let's get right to it. Let's not waste any time. Let's get to the point. We're going to talk serious, and we're not going to waste any time. And that's kind of become pervasive in Western culture. I can imagine that the Italians and the French and the Irish and the Greeks are all going, no, we're not doing that. But anyway, so the point is, this woman, and she said, you know, if you get somebody who's from a community of Pakistan or Africa or wherever, what you're going to find is that they will spend some time establishing human contacts, which is a good thing, isn't it? They will talk about who they know. but they won't get right down to business. And I thought the woman who was telling us this had no experience of culture probably outside London or Manchester, in certainly in most of Britain, but certainly even in England, that's what happens. People know people. Certainly, I mean, my daughter is going out with a man who I was in the same class as his mother at school. Further than that, her grandmother, my mother, was a playmate of his grandmother. And, it's very common to, when we meet, to go, I worked with your cousin, or, and that is still, and I actually value that, really. I think it's going away, but I think it's a loss anyway, but there we are. How did I get onto this? I was talking about the attachment, and listen, there are downsides to that. You think of women who became pregnant out of wedlock in a small community like that. They were damned. There was no, or if you made a mistake that the community looked down upon, that was you were finished there. So there's pros and cons, and everything in life is nuanced. There's very few things that are black and white. In fact, I'd probably go out on a limb and say nothing is. Anyway, so that's what we have it, and we have this poor. He's a townie. He's from a city. He's not even English. Cymrodia, of course, and so he just isn't going to get this, and he tries to, and he's a modernizer. And so it's, and I can imagine that Christopher Woodforde came across this so many times. He was a priest who was deeply embedded in very rural communities, so he would know this, and he must have seen. And I don't know what his politics was. I would guess he's naturally conservative, but he would have seen the movement in the church that wanted to modernize things with all these colors and stuff like that. And it doesn't matter. You're going to say to these people, I think we should change things, and they don't like changing things. Things have worked for a long time as they are. People are comfortable with that, and so that's what it is. And so, but the sin, if you like, then it wasn't Reverend Evans who killed Cushi. Cushi caught a cold and died. But there was no love lost between them because they came from different camps. They were part of their own culture wars, weren't they? And you know how these days, the culture wars, I'm very worried about them, really, that people are so polarized now that the other side is monstered. And I don't think it's got quite as far as this in this story. But, it's certainly that. There's the urban modernizers versus the rural conservatives, in this story. And there's death involved in it, So I think the implication is that Cushi wished him dead. I think sometimes I have an inkling that I've missed something, and and that's the last thing is it's best to leave old Cushi to follow his way. And I think that's Reverend Woodforde saying, best just leave things as they are, let things just be as they always have been. That's not necessarily possible these days, but it's interesting that, I tell you what I think, that every age, every period thinks it is the final solution to history, the end of history. And so when I was growing up, there was what looked like a terminal decline in Christian church attendance, and we were like, and it was seen, this is the end of it. This is the end of organized Christianity. And we thought that was the case. And we saw it all across Europe, in parts of America, but not so much. And now there's a resurgence. And if you think about, I remember saying the early 19th century rather, it was quite a godless time. And then there was a massive revival as the 19th century went on, which led to hundreds and hundreds of churches. Many of the churches, as you go around in the country, in the UK these days, are Victorian, and this represents the revival. New churches being built, and so it's been in its death throes on and off for a bit. And then I'm reading many books, but There's a great book called World Turned Upside Down. It's on the floor behind me by Christopher Hill, and it's about the radical nature of the English Civil War and the Revolution. And many of the people there are atheistic. They don't want anything to do with the clerics and the church. And so it just, now, as I'm a bit older, I look back and think, you always think that you've got the answer, and then it turns out you didn't know what you were talking about, and you made a fool of by history, really. So let's not say that it's finished yet. It's just very interesting. That's all. I'm not making a point. And funnily enough, I know a couple of people. There's a friend of mine told me he'd been brought up a Catholic, and he's gone back to the Catholic Church in his 60s, and then he works with a guy who's become Orthodox, and there are many people actually turning to the Orthodox Church, and I think what's my explanation for that? I think it's because people who've been brought up in an Anglican tradition feel that it's lost its spiritual power, inheritance, and so, but they can't go to the Catholic Church because there's that tremendous split that's been deep in Western culture for 500, 600 years. And so they go to the Orthodox Church. But because the split between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church, going back to the 11th century, doesn't feel like it's just too old to have registered. So, so anyway, so old Christopher Woodforde. Yeah, I enjoyed the story. It was good. That's probably all I've got to say. I've been a bit rambly. Last time I was a bit peppery. Now I'm a bit rambly. I've been out today. I've been on 2 dog walks, and I've been to the gym, and I'm a bit tired, probably. That's the thing. Anyway, I hope you're all well. It's been a beautiful autumn day here. Quite warm, but really lots of sunshine. Very nice. Very, very nice.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?